everyone, my name is Yasmina Bayash and I'm the Communications Coordinator here at TechSoup Canada. Thank you all for joining us on today's webinar, Creating a Content Strategy for Your Nonprofit Website. So first, as we always do, we would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which TechSoup Canada office operates. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations and the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. All right, so before we get started, I'd like to quickly introduce you to TechSoup Canada. Our mission is to help nonprofits use technology effectively, and we accomplish this in two ways. The first is to make technology products more affordable through our technology donations program. We partner with tech companies such as Microsoft, Adobe, and Symantec and offer their products as either an outright donation or at a significant discount for charities, nonprofits, and libraries across Canada. Membership is free, and it gets you access to donated and discounted software from more than 30 tech companies. Through this program, we've helped over 31,400 nonprofits save more than $362 million in tech investments. And the second way we try to help nonprofits use technology effectively is by creating and curating nonprofit tech resources. We write blogs, curate content on social media, and host events and webinars like this one to help nonprofits learn more about the technologies that can help them in their day-to-day work. So if there's any topic you'd like to learn about, please let us know. We're always eager to get feedback from our members. All right, and for today's webinar, you can use the GoToWebinar panel on your right-hand side to change your audio settings, enter any questions you have, or chat with us. At the end of the webinar presentation, we will have a Q&A session. We also, during the session, will be sending you some resources that Marlene would like to share with you, and that'll appear in the chat box. And just a reminder that you are on mute, so if you have any questions or concerns, you can chat with us in the same box, and it is the question box. Also, note that this webinar is being recorded, and we will upload the video with a summary and slide deck on our website shortly. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Marlene Oliveira. Marlene is a communications advisor and copywriter at MoFlow and founder of the nonprofit Mark Community blog. Having worked in the nonprofit sector since 1999, Marlene specializes in working with capacity building and grant-making organizations. Her approach is to tap into the knowledge and wisdom her clients already possess to help the communications flow. All right, and now we can go ahead and get started with Marlene and learn about how to create the content strategy.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I'm going to bring up my slides, and I'm just going to do a quick check to make sure that you can see them.
Yes, they're great.
Excellent. All right. I have had the situation where I didn't check often enough on a webinar and got too far before I learned about some major mistake like that. So thank you so much for the introduction and the welcome and for having me here. And thank you to everyone who is on this call. Yasmin was telling me about the fact that this is a very popular topic and that it seems that strategy is a popular topic with TechSoup audiences, which thrills me to no end. So Yasmin has told you a little bit about me. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my work, but first I want to jump right in with a little mini exercise. I want to ask you as participants in a webinar on this topic, your opinion. So I have a client who is planning a new website and they're stuck on a few little choices. So I wonder if you would just make mental note of, your take on these choices I'm about to show you. The first one is a color palette dilemma. We're deciding between what I'm showing here as color palette number 1 or color palette number 2. The second thing we're getting stuck on is where to put the volunteer section and the link to the volunteer content in terms of navigation. So, there's debate. Does this belong in the main navigation or in a drop down from the navigation, or should this be put into a header or a footer? And then the last one is what should go in the sidebar? Should it be links to the organization's social networks? Should it be the email sign up or the search function? What makes the most sense to feature in the sidebar? Now, if you're feeling frustrated that I'm asking you this because you don't have the answers, that's the point of my exercise. You shouldn't have the answers. And the reason you shouldn't have the answers is that even though you might be experienced pros when it comes to nonprofit communications, or you know a thing or two about websites, you don't have any context for making these decisions or these recommendations. And the context that you're missing is the website content strategy. So this isn't real. I made it all up. There's no client of mine that's really struggling with any of these, but I did it to make a point. And this is why we're talking about website content strategy today, so that you, when you are making your plans for your next website, that you have the right context for those plans. So I wanted to share a quote from the authors of the book, a book that I recommend, Content Strategy for the Web. They say that content strategy helps us to find ways to better understand all aspects of our content, which means that we can make smarter, more informed decisions about how we're going to select and execute our tactics. So this is why I'm such an advocate for content strategy. They summed it up nicely here. We want to make smarter and informed decisions when we're building our websites. When you have a website content strategy in place, then you have a framework for making decisions. So of course, and obviously, you have a framework for making content decisions, but as I'll share in a few examples as we go, this also gives you the framework for making development and design decisions. The work that you put into developing a website content strategy gives you an opportunity to work with internal and external stakeholders and achieve some alignment and consensus in the right way at the right times. And then, of course, the most obvious benefit is that you're going to build a website that is better, more effective at supporting your organization's goals. With a website content strategy in hand, you're going to have a written guide for the content you develop now and in the future. And it's a guide that you can share with others who create content for you. And then, of course, as I said, you're going to create a website that connects your purpose and your content with your site visitors and their needs. Now, one thing I want to say to reassure you is that this isn't anything foreign. Website planning is communications planning. So the same principles apply. You have to understand the strategy first, and then you plan the content and the technology or the delivery around that strategy. And so a lot of what I go over today might seem familiar to you. It's just applied in the context of website planning. But even though it's familiar, a lot of people want to skip over it, and that can lead to problems. So we're going to avoid those problems. Yasmin did such a nice introduction of me, so I just want to add a couple of details that I have been running my business since early 2008. I also run another blog, and I only mention that because I'm going to share a resource from that blog during our presentation today, but it's called the Nonprofit Mark Community. And through that blog, I help nonprofit communicators share their experience and knowledge with each other, so that there's a whole library of content for anyone who needs help with how to do marketing communications in our sector. And the focus of my business in terms of the services I deliver are storytelling, branding, and website content strategy, which makes me a content specialist. I'm not a tech specialist. That's not why I'm here today. And I'm going to ask you to remember that when we get later on to the Q&A. I am a content planner first and foremost, a content planner and creator first and foremost. And so what that means is I've seen what happens when organizations don't put content first and they build websites and then try to fit content in after. So I've seen what goes wrong when content comes last. I've been running my business, as I mentioned, since 2008. So for 10 years, I've been working with clients. And for 6 years before that, I was a communications manager at a national health organization. So I've been through many website builds or redesigns. And I would reiterate over and over again, as I will, that content should come first. Of course, I just went over all the reasons why I'm a content specialist. So of course I would say content comes first. So I asked my friend who's a web developer to share some insights that I've included in this presentation, Mike Mella from Be Like Water. So you don't have to always take my word for it as a content advocate, take a developer's word for it. And here's what Mike has to say about putting content first. Mike says that your content is not simply a replacement for placeholder text. It's the thing that gets designed. So let's look at what we're going to go over today during this webinar. So This is an introductory level webinar to introduce you to the idea of website content strategy, and I'm going to show you how to put content first. We've already started at a minimal level to explore the benefits of creating a clearly defined and documented web content strategy, and that goes far beyond planning. So we're going to look at why you need to develop your content strategy before you start any website design or development work. I'm going to go over the elements that I believe you should include in your website content strategy, and I'm going to shed some light on the steps involved in building one. And then I'm going to address the topic of how to include internal stakeholders in productive ways, in helpful and productive ways. And I'm going to share some very specific details about some steps you can take to do that internal consultation. What we're not going to talk about today is the specific content that you should feature on your website, or any kind of really tactical level content planning, though I am going to share a resource to help you with that. But the reason we're not going to talk about those two things is because before you get there, you need to be able to answer why. It's a question that you should be asking and answering frequently throughout this process. And when you start with a website content strategy, you'll be answering all of the whys up front. With each decision that you need to make, your website content strategy should have the answers to why, so that when you're moving to the next level and the next level, you've got it all there. So out of curiosity, I have another exercise. It's not going to be all exercises today, but this is the second and last one I'm going to ask you to participate in. Let's see if you have the answers to the following. So assuming that you are here because you're planning a new website in the coming months, I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I invite you to make notes with your answers as you go. So I will pause so that you have a chance to make notes if you have a pen and paper handy or a notes app open. Share, or not share, but write down, make note of your answers to the following questions. So the first question is, why are you building or redesigning your website? What does that website need to achieve for your organization? So I'm just going to pause for a moment so you have a chance to both think about that and write it down. And while you're writing, if you wrote down awareness, I'm going to ask you to cross that out and write down something that's more specific than that. And then as you're finishing that one up, and I realize that I'm maybe rushing you through this takes some thought, but just do your best in the short time I'm giving you. The second question is, who are your priority audiences? So who are you hoping will visit this website that you're planning? And as you're writing, if you are writing down the words general public, then once again, I'm going to ask you to cross that out and write something more specific. Write down visitors that you most need to reach through your website. Most organizations will have several. So try to break down the groups of people that you're thinking about. And then question 3, what does your website need to say? What are the key messages that it needs to communicate? You might want to consider in this case your organization's key messages, overarching key messages, if you have sort of a brand or campaign platform that you've developed. But then think of the messages that your site must communicate. And then my last question for now is, what actions do you want visitors to take? What are the most important actions visitors are going to take on your website? So I'm not giving you a ton of time. I know that was quick, but I'll ask you to just have a look at what you've written down. And in response to the questions I asked, and consider whether those answers came easily. Now, if those answers came really easily for you, you might be in the wrong place because you've already done the thinking for some of the really important elements of your content strategy. It means that you have some of the building blocks of your strategy in place already. But if there are any blanks, or if it's all blank, or if you struggle to know what I even meant, then let's break this down. Let's head into the elements of a website content strategy. So before I get into the specific elements, I do want to reiterate that this is simply a document. It doesn't have to be particularly long or complex, but your website content strategy should be written down. So key that it's written down, might just be a few pages. It should reflect your best thinking and research and consultation synthesized into that simple document. And it should include the following elements, starting with your website's purpose. So you should have a more specific communications objectives than we need a new website. And as I alluded to already, you need to be answering what it is you need your new website to achieve. Since your site exists to move your organization toward achieving your mission, you need to connect your site back to specific organizational goals. And for many organizations, you'll find those goals in your nonprofit strategic plan. A lot of the time, I don't know if this applies to people on this webinar, but many organizations are building a new website not long after a new strategic plan, after completing a new strategic plan. And so then it's top of mind for you. But if it's not top of mind, go back and revisit it. So looking back to your organization's broader goals, articulate your communications objectives, and then what you want to accomplish through your website. Those may not always be completely aligned. So I wanted to share a few examples during this webinar. And what I've done is I've pulled examples, I've sort of cherry picked elements of different content strategies from 3 different clients that I've worked with, so that partly that they can be a little bit anonymous in this presentation, but also to show you some variety. So the first set of examples I wanted to show you come from the website purpose section of 3 different website content strategies. So in the case of one client, and I emphasize that I'm cherry picking here because for any of these strategies, they each had a few different objectives, but one objective for one client was to expand the reach of their client services program. An objective for a different organization, among their others, was to provide access to their training and library of tools. And then for another, it was an education-based objective. It was to explain the importance of diversity and inclusion. So I share these examples to help you think about what yours might be. And when you know what they are, then you'll know what content you need to put in place to achieve your objectives. You'll understand the types of content you need and how each piece can lead people in a path toward what you want to achieve. And we're going to talk about outcomes a little bit later, but we're starting with the big picture here in terms of purpose. Then we'll talk about how to measure whether we're achieving that. A second element of the content strategy that I think is absolutely essential is your priority, a list of your priority audiences. You shouldn't be making any content decisions until you've identified and prioritized your core audiences or your most important visitors to your site. And yes, I'll repeat it, you need to ditch the general public and narrow this down. The number of audiences that you list in your content strategy, it's going to depend on the size and scope and complexity of your organization. But as much as you can, get as narrowed down as you can, narrow it down as much as you can. And really be honest with yourself about which relationships you will be able to facilitate and strengthen and nurture and move along a path of engagement on your website, and others where it's really not as critical. There may be some cases where the relationship is, very basic in terms of online, but it's more of an offline relationship. So really think about the people who you need to come to your site and for whom the website is a place where you need them to be reading and taking action. Here again are some cherry-picked examples from other organizations' website content strategies. So one organization had one audience that was people who work in government and other policymakers, obviously working in a specific portfolio. A different organization needed to reach healthcare professionals working in the area of rehabilitation. And this one relates back to training and tools in terms of getting them access to training and tools. And then yet another organization needed to directly reach executive directors of nonprofit organizations. So getting nice and specific and thinking about the people that you want visiting your site, the next step is to create marketing personas. So if you are already in communications, then you are probably already familiar with audience personas or marketing personas, which are profiles of representative members of your audience, including their needs, their interests, their preferences. They usually start with some demographic information and maybe some psychographic information. And when you're developing personas in the context of website content strategy, you're going to add answers to questions like, why are they visiting the site? What are they specifically hoping to do on the site? What are their information wants and needs? What questions are they trying to answer? So if creating marketing personas is new to you, I've shared a few resources with Yasmin, and she's going to share them with you. So I believe she's going to pop some of them into the chat and also share them after the webinar along with the webinar recording. So if you don't have a chance to go over now, you can get it later. But I do have a resource on a blog post on my website that lists a number of different templates to help you with creating marketing personas. It's a super important step. You can't skip it. You really have to do the step, because to give your web visitors an experience that makes them stay and read and take action, you need to give them what they want. And to give them what they want, you have to get to know them. Now, and this, I should have advanced to the slide. So a good way to do this for a lot of nonprofit organizations in terms of creating marketing personas is to have conversations with internal stakeholders who know them best. I have a guide that I'm going to share at the end of the webinar. So if you were quickly like writing down the questions that I was suggesting you ask yourself about these personas, don't worry, they're all captured in a guide that I'm going to share a little bit later on. So this audience identification and prioritization and then creating of marketing personas is also important because it helps you to avoid the mistake of being too inwardly focused when making website decisions. It is a way to head off too much internal bias in terms of your board or senior management or colleagues always being at the forefront of every decision you make. This is a way to balance that. So it's not all about what internal players want from your site. It's what the visitors need too. And it's much easier to do this when you've really painted a vivid picture of who the audience members are. And it's helpful when you've collaborated to create this picture. It's again about involving internal stakeholders in the right way at the right time. So I do have a couple of other quotes from Mike that I'm going to share, but again, it's to make the case that it's not just me, someone who focuses on content, who wants you to do this. Web developers want you to do this too. So Mike shared his opinion on creating personas. He says, creating personas for your audiences puts you and your developer on the same page as far as knowing how to present your website's content. Everyone has the same clear examples of what your target audience looks like. And visualizing this helps your developer to present navigation or content in a way that's appropriate for each visitor's journey through the site. So from the content planning side to the content development side to the development and design, we all want you to have a clear understanding of your audiences. All right. The next element that I believe you should have in your content strategy is a description of the voice and tone of your website content. Now, conversational copy written in an active voice works well for the web in general when you're writing for the web, and it should always be free of jargon, as any of your content should be. And you should write in a way that reflects your organization's specific brand personality. I don't believe that this exercise belongs in a website content planning process. It belongs in the branding process. But if your organization has defined a brand personality, now is the time to bring it into your website content strategy and remember it and remind yourself of what it is. And if you don't have such a thing, then you may have a gap in your branding and your brand platform, and that may be something else you want to pay some attention to. So here are some brand personality examples from 3 different client organizations, and they want their personality attributes that come across in their marketing to be, in one case, funny and accessible. In another case, an organization wants their language to sound confident, flexible, and approachable. And yet another wants to come across as resourceful, gritty, and supportive. So you can see that even if we're all using conversational copy in an active voice that's jargon-free, these brand personalities bring a nuance to the voice and tone as well. And so this should come across in the voice and tone of your written content and the way you present your content. But this is an example of when you have a content strategy in place, it will also help when you get to the design process. So a brand personality would help to inform decisions like font selection or color scheme or imagery or other graphics that you'll use on your site. So you can see how it helps you now and it'll help you in the future. And again, it's based on internal consultation at the beginning, so you're not asking people's opinions about color. The color choices are informed by this work that you've done and your brand personality. All right, the next element that you should include in your website content strategy is your website key messages. So you're probably used to articulating key messages for your communications campaigns, for example. Take the time to articulate a few website key messages for each of the audiences you've identified once you've identified them. So what you would do is you would go through each of your listed audiences and answer the question, if your website was a person speaking to a member of your priority audience, what would you want it to say? I'm going to pause for a sip of water. So when you do this exercise, you're going to keep it simple and just write down a sentence or two for each audience. This one is probably best illustrated with examples. So here are three, again, cherry-picked different examples from 3 different organizations. So one website key message out of several for one organization is, you can come to us for a connection to a broader movement. For another organization and a separate audience, they want to communicate, we can help you position your organization as a leader in accessibility and inclusion in your community. That was a message directed to corporate supporters and businesses that were participating in their training. Another key message is, we can open the door to new leadership opportunities. Pausing, I'm trying to fight off a cough here. So when you think about your website as a person speaking to those members of your various audiences that you've articulated with a specific message, you can see how this will start to guide what content you need to feature on your website. Now, the 5th element of the content strategy that I recommend is to list out your desired actions or outcomes. So this connects back to, obviously, the purpose that we talked about in number 1. And thinking about each of your audiences one at a time, consider, what actions do you want visitors to take on your site? Decide what really matters. What actions do they want to take? And remember to balance the actions that they want to take with those that are going to support your business objectives, so to speak, and then prioritize. So it might be helpful, because for any nonprofit I've ever worked with, other than the most small and simple in terms of programming, there's all kinds of competing actions or outcomes that various internal stakeholders are hoping for. So it's helpful to prioritize at least top 3 per audience. And then you can also look for some commonalities that you might want more than one audience member to do. But it helps to start to streamline and helps you to prioritize what you're featuring in your content and on your website. So these examples are from a range of different clients, but they will look familiar or maybe applicable to many people on the webinar. So one example is newsletter subscriptions, downloading of important reports or other documents, social media shares of content, program or event registrations, donations made online, or training purchased. When you have this articulated and prioritized and you hand your strategy over to your designer and developer, they can visualize your visitor's experience, including things like navigation or functionality or features for each section and for the site as a whole. It could also help them to decide about the visual weight of each element. And you, as the content creator, the person who's going to be responsible for writing the content, can figure out what content you need to put in place in order to guide visitors down the right path, the path of taking action. You'll know what calls to action to include with each page of content or article blog post, or other content that you feature on your site, which is so helpful when it comes time to write. And that leads us to the sixth and final element in the website content strategy, and that's your content buckets and your topics list. So with the work you've done so far, you have gathered the intelligence and insights to make smart decisions about what content you need. And I refer to those as kind of two separate things: the priority topics or content buckets that you'll need to feature on your site, and then specific list of articles or pages that you need written. So with the information you have about purpose and objectives, audiences, your key messages, then you can make some decisions about what topics you need to feature on your site related to your cause or your issue, what content you need to create in order to explain the work of your organization or your organization in general, the programs and services that you offer. You'll have the information you need to explain how people can support that work and get involved with what you do. And anything else you need to write about, say, your people or your partners or other supporters. Make some decisions now about the main content you're going to produce, revise, and repurpose, as well as the new content or the content you're going to need to produce on an ongoing basis, such as updates or blog posts. Now, I have some examples of these two sort of categories here. So in terms of content buckets, and these will look familiar, it's not rocket science, but sometimes it takes a little strategy work to pull some of these buckets out to realize that they are the main sections of a website. I think every organization will need to have about us and about us content bucket. Depending on what you do, you might need to have a bucket for your content about your programs. If you offer education, maybe a section or a bucket. I'm trying not to say section because we're not actually thinking of the website yet, just the content. But on learning and tools, a bucket of content that's about how people can support the organization. For some organizations that either conduct or fund research, we may need to have content that explains the research that's being funded, where the money is going, or the results of research if your organization does your own research. So those are some examples of content buckets. And then for each of those content buckets, you'll drill down to a topic list. And I'm choosing about us for this example because it will probably be relevant for most organizations. And it might look exactly like this or very similar. So if one organization realized that their About Us content bucket needed the main About Us content, that they in particular needed to talk about their history and have a place to share their mission and vision. They wanted to talk about their impact on their website. It was really important for them. One of the key actions that they wanted people to take was actually just find contact information to take the conversation offline, but they needed people to be able to easily find that. So it was very important that their staff listing was there and that all of the contact information and an explanation of their different regional offices was there. Again, they, like many organizations, they featured their board and they wanted to showcase their partners and other supporters. So this is getting more into what you would think of as actual pages of content. There would be a page that has our history, a page with our impact, for example. So those are the elements of a website content strategy: your purpose, your audiences, your voice and tone, the key messages, your actions and outcomes, measurable outcomes, and the contents and topics you're going to feature on your site. Are you feeling ready? I know it can be a bit daunting, but when you make an investment in these carefully laid plans, it is definitely worth it. Unfortunately, not a lot of nonprofits are doing it this way. It's so awesome to me that there are so many people on this webinar because you want to do it the right way. When I first delivered this presentation, when I first pulled together this content, I have my own client examples, but I put several calls out on social media and through my email newsletter asking people to share their experience of having started with content strategy before building their website. And I literally did not receive a single response. I received responses, but it was people saying we didn't do it that way. So I asked my two friends who are web developers, Mike, who I've already been referring to, and another friend and respected web developer who works with nonprofits, Yesenia Sotelo, she's at Smart Cause, for examples from their own work with clients. And I have to tell you that when I first asked Yesenia, she laughed. She actually laughed because I said, the way I had worded it was, can you share any examples of organizations in the past year or so that came to you with a content strategy? And she didn't have any, but she did have these two examples from Everyday Democracy and Nonprofit Leadership Alliance, two of her clients. And she said they're very much the exception, and they were top of mind for her because although they were not new websites, they did, when they originally came to her, they came with a content strategy in hand. And she said their websites are holding up over time. And she wanted me to share the message that organizations save money when they come to a developer well prepared, and they definitely spend more money when they don't. And then Mike shared a couple of examples. Again, he said it was very rare to see someone show up and hand them a content strategy. But he shared examples of two clients who came with their content fully developed and thought out. Alberta Midwives and the Canadian Pediatric Society. And in this case, it's a microsite. I'm just going to show you some pages on the microsite here. And he said they had absolute clarity about their audiences, the actions their audiences wanted to take, any special requirements, the content developed to meet those requirements. They had even come prepared, I believe it was in the case of the midwives, come prepared with photography that could be used. And he said with these two clients, the takeaway for him was that he had everything he needed to create and build a site around the content, and he didn't have to try to fit content, new content in unnaturally or awkwardly into a site design after the fact. So I did say we would spend the bulk of the time talking about the elements of a content strategy, but I want to set you up with a little bit of guidance in terms of how to create it. This will really vary depending on how you do your work and where you are at, where your organization is at in terms of planning, in terms of the year. As I alluded to before, if you've just come out of a strategic planning process, you probably have a lot of this information articulated, or at least it wouldn't be much of a stretch to go to the next step. But in case you do need help with figuring some of these things out, I want to touch on a few important steps. But again, I want to remind everyone that this isn't meant to at all to be a cumbersome make work document. It's really just that you are documenting your thinking and some planning and some consultation that you've invested time in. So keeping in mind that a strong website content strategy is built on research and consultation, I do have a few top level steps for you. So one of those steps is to conduct a content audit. It's so important that you conduct a content audit so that you know what content you already have and what the gaps are you need to fill. This is another case where I have shared a resource with Yasmin about how to conduct a content audit. It's not actually something I do. I'm just going to pop over to see in the chat if the links are coming through. So
yes, yeah, it should be right there at 12.
I see it right there. Yes, perfect. So it's called How to Conduct a Website Content Audit for Your Nonprofit, and that's over on the Nonprofit More Community blog. Thank you, Yasmin. And that will walk you step by step through how to do that if that's unfamiliar to you. Something else that I recommend that you do is that you get familiar with your organization's strategic plan if you aren't already familiar with it. I've lost my cursor. Oh, here we go. And then really important is that you consult with internal stakeholders. So this is so important that I'm going to break that one step down in a moment, but engaging them in the right way and in a strategic way. And then also making sure that you're reviewing any and all available relevant data that you can have access to. For example, website analytics, email analytics, reader surveys, program evaluations, anything that you can get your hands on that will give you information about what content is popular, what content drives people to take action, what content is missing from your existing website. And then, of course, I probably sound like a broken record on this, but that step unto itself of creating marketing personas, about researching your site visitors and understanding them as well as you can, having one-on-one conversations with people who are members of these visitor groups, if you can, to ask them questions and check any assumptions you've made on your own or even in your consultation with internal stakeholders. So back to the meaningful consultation with internal stakeholders. Remember at the beginning of the presentation when I asked you to weigh in on colors and sidebars and navigation? I did that because it's something I see so many organizations do. And when they do that, when they go to peers or share with leadership, this is what we're thinking about our color scheme, or this is, what do you think about this navigation or this navigation? Really what that is asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. Rather than try to gather people's opinions, gather useful insights that they can provide that will guide your strategy development. And I really recommend that you involve them early on in productive ways, in ways that will eventually inform the details of design and development. So I have 3 specific ideas for you about, and it depends on your organization, but ways that you can consult with internal stakeholders in meaningful and productive ways. And those are to ask for their help with understanding your website's visitors and creating those marketing personas, to involve them in conducting your website content audit, and to get their help in understanding the questions that your site needs to answer. So I'll break those down a little bit here. I'm going to keep the same slide up, and I want to let you know that right after I go through this, I'm going to share a guide that captures a lot of what I'm about to say, because this is going to be a little bit rapid fire, but it's all captured for you in a guide that I've created. So in terms of asking for internal stakeholders' help with understanding your website's visitors, in most organizations, in most nonprofit organizations, there are certain internal players who can give you the insights you need about certain audiences. So here are a few quite obvious examples, but they'll show you what I mean. So you can ask fund development staff, you can ask them about insights about donors, obviously. Program staff can describe participants for you. Volunteer development can help you to understand existing and potential volunteers. Involve these people in your marketing persona development and explain that their involvement and the personas that you create together will inform website design and development plans down the road. So they really are, it's not token involvement. It's not a committee being struck so everyone's sitting in the room while you try to make website decisions. They really are sharing insights that are of value to you. And when you're sitting down with these internal stakeholders and as you're developing personas together, ask the people you're consulting questions like, why are these audiences important to you in your role and to the organization in general? What questions do they ask, or what information are they hoping to find on our website? What actions do they come to the website to take, or what actions would we like them to take? So that's all about consulting them, involving them in understanding your website's visitors. Another separate way you can involve internal stakeholders is to involve them in conducting your website's content audit. In this case, what you're doing is enlisting the help of your organization's various content owners. I'm putting owners in quotation marks, or subject matter experts, to help you get a clear picture of the current website content that's up there, what you're going to keep on the new site, what you need to remove, what needs to be updated or developed, and who has responsibility for these different pieces of content. So you don't just stop by asking them to fill in a spreadsheet as you're conducting your audit. You get them involved in the conversation. You probably need their insights in some cases about whether something is really out of date or in need of help, or we need to add a call to action to it. And you might involve them in answering questions like, what messages are we currently communicating? And what messages do we need to shift, or what new messages do we need to bring into the new website? Or how well does the content that we have on hand align with our strategic goals, or our messaging, or our brand personality? And by doing this audit, it will help you to understand the scope of the work ahead, including the time and resources you need to allocate to writing. It will help them to see the scope of the project that you are doing in terms of the website build. And it may be a good time to enlist them early in some of the writing and editing and revising. And then the third step that I have here is in getting their help in understanding the questions that your website needs to answer. So this is all about moving away from communicating what you want to say and to start offering information that your audiences are seeking. And your website needs to answer visitor questions. So find out what those questions are, ask around. Even if your colleagues don't have the answers yet, they are very likely able to tell you what your audiences want to know. And I'm thinking about the online relationship, but a lot of these questions could come from offline relationships and in-person interactions. So again, to use some of those obvious examples that will apply at a lot of nonprofit organizations, you can ask fund development team members what questions do potential donors ask when they're considering supporting our organization? What is it that they want to know about our work and where their dollars are going? Those are just a few examples. You can ask program staff, what questions are participants asking in order to select, attend, and decide whether or not to participate in programs? What practical and logistical questions do they ask in order to get to your programs? And what do they want to know about what happens inside of specific programs and services? Another group you can talk to are people who have a more general connection to the community, more of a frontline connection to sort of first contact with the organization. So you could ask if you have a receptionist or someone who generally answers the phone, general calls, or community managers on social media who are talking to the community in general. What in general inquiries are coming in about our organization and about our cause and our issue? What general questions are coming in that we need to address on our website? And once you found out what people are asking, you can move on to answering the questions in your new website's content. So it's once you've done this type of work that you can go back and make those content bucket lists, and as well as the detailed topic list that I talked about before. So I've talked a few times about a guide that I've pulled together in the past for my email subscribers. So this is something that's available if you sign up to hear from me more often about website content strategy and other related topics. But I call it a guide to conducting interviews with internal stakeholders. It's not very catchy, but it's all about website content strategy. So you can go over there, and in that document, I've listed questions that you would use to get a better understanding of your objectives, of your audiences, to develop personas, and to find out what questions people are asking on your site. I see Ben's note that my website was not cooperating. I think it's not used to the amount of traffic in terms of the number of participants on this webinar. So sorry about that, guys. And of course, we'll have those links available after in case there are any more problems while we're live here on the call. All right, so after you create the strategy, then you create your detailed content plan. So you might have wondered when I was talking before about why the actual content seemed like one small element out of 6 elements that I discussed today. And the reason for that is that content strategy is sort of like a compass that guides all of your decisions. And you will move on to the detailed decisions after using that compass as your guide. So when you move on to the content plan, this is kind of more, if the analogy flows, more of your atlas, where it's a detailed capture of all of the information. And so once you have identified your priority content buckets and topics, you can use your content strategy and move the buckets and topics list over into a content plan. And this can be a document, a table, or a spreadsheet. And in this plan, you're going to identify, for this first column, you're just moving over decisions you already made about the specific content you need. You might make notes about the hierarchy, about the core content and then supporting content. You should have a column that, again, you're bringing this over from your website content strategy. So it outlines your purpose, the purpose of each piece of content. I'm just showing this example that's on the slide. It's probably hard to read, but the link I'm sharing here is where you can go to see it again. And also there'll be a bit more help over there. So you'll list your audiences for each piece of content and the key messages and the call to action for each piece of content. So as a writer, someone who has to create the content, when you have this all outlined, for every single piece of content, you know what it is, why it belongs on the website, who it's written for, the key message it needs to convey, and the call to action that you're going to include on each page. It makes writing so much easier. It also helps with going back and reviewing existing content and just sprucing it up. And then depending on your process or your plans and the number of contributors that you have, you might want to include more fields here. So before I go any further, let me just explain a little better. So I have included this link. It's in the chat as well. But this is a blog post about how to go from content strategy to content plan. I've included this visual, but I have also included in that blog post a Google Sheet, so you can download it and create your own content plan using the template that I've provided. So you might, if this is a big project, a large organization, a lot of players, you might want more columns for things like responsibility, who's responsible for each piece of content, the timing. So that would be where you would make notes about things like the status of a piece of content, whether it's being drafted, under review, ready for publication, requires an update. You might also use a timing column in terms of prioritizing. You know, this is to be done for the launch of the website. This can be done once the site is launched in a second and third stage. You might make some other notes. So you might make notes about who needs to see what piece of content, what are the reviews and approvals required. If you're making note of target keywords or key phrases that each piece of content needs to include, or other notes or instructions. So what this is all about is making realistic plans and getting it all out there so you can see what is the challenges ahead and make decisions about the time and resource based on the time and resources that you have available. And so that you can prioritize strategic, useful, and relevant content ahead of wish list items, which you can always add to once you've built your strong foundation of core content. You can get as detailed as you need to with this plan, adding anything you need to get it ready long before the site launch. And this is the thing. I don't know if this is the part that you thought we were going to be talking about today. This is the part that everyone wants to skip ahead to. But without a content strategy in place, how will you meaningfully populate these different fields? The content strategy gives you the purpose and the audiences and the key message. So this part is all about charting it out, not about thinking it through as you go, developing and planning your content. All right, so this is a lot of work. It's big and it does take time, but it is your starting point. This is how you put content first when it comes to developing a new site. And again, there's been a few cases where I want to say, don't take my word for it. So in this case, I want to share a comment from a client and friend, Marcus, over at Maytree. And I worked with him on their website content strategy a couple of years ago. And Marcus says, the process is incredibly valuable and will save you so much time in the long run. You'll have a better understanding of what you're trying to do and have a much better sense of whether your website is actually meeting your requirements. So it doesn't get better than that. I'm sure that's very compelling. And I always like to ask you to take action at the end of any kind of presentation. So what I would recommend to you, if you have a web redesign or website build coming up, look ahead to your plans and your final launch date and book time in your calendar now to get the strategy work done. So you can bring in help from someone like me, and Yasmin was kind enough to share a link to this service that I offer, but you can definitely do it on your own. I'm giving you a lot of tools today, either what we've talked about or links that you can go look at later to do it on your own. And you will know better than I do how long you're going to need for each step, how many people you need to talk to, how maybe bureaucratic or streamlined the process is in your organization. But I'm going to recommend you give yourself at least 6 weeks. This isn't like a spend a day planning on a Friday afternoon kind of project. Book off 6 weeks ahead of any point in time that you're going to start talking about actually building the website, 6 weeks before that. And that's it. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to bring up the slide with that guide that I shared with you because it really relates to a lot of the things that we talked about today. And in it, I've given you a long list of questions to work from in order to have those conversations with your colleagues and get them involved in creating your website content strategy. And that's it. I think we are over to questions now.
Yes, we are. So thanks so much, Marlene, for this great presentation and all the templates you provided, which are really, really useful.
Thank you.
We now have some time to take questions from the audience. So just to let the audience know, if you haven't entered your questions yet, please do so now by using the questions chat box in the GoToWebinar panel. All right, and so you sort of ended the presentation talking about how this will take 6 weeks. Things will change as you're going along, right? So one of the questions was, does the site need to be updated and constantly changing to keep the interest and I guess the requests of return visitors?
Does the site need to constantly change to keep people coming back? Is that?
Yeah, in terms of the strategy you're going along, how much will it change, I suppose, is the question. You build one strategy, you launch the site, how does that change as you go along?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I don't think this is something that should change a whole lot more frequently than your strategic plan should change. And so it should serve you for a few years, I would think. And I can tell you, I hope Marcus doesn't mind me sharing this, but I just shared a quote from Marcus, who's a past client, and he has told me he's revisited this strategy we've developed together for a few years. He keeps going back to it, that the core of it, while some details may shift, the core of it remains an important guide for them. In terms of keeping things fresh, though, that's where you can build new content. You almost will never be able to write and produce everything that you were hoping to produce for launch day. So you have an opportunity to continue to grow your library of content, as well as add features in like a blog to show people that you are paying attention and you're updating them on emerging news or emerging issues as you go in terms of your nonprofit's work.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And another question we have is, what are some of the ways to collaborate or connect with the audience in developing persona profiles? We actually have more than one question on personas that seem to be of interest.
Mm-hmm. This is a tough one. And I have to admit that for a lot of organizations, especially with me being a consultant, I don't get access directly to visitors in the way that could be helpful. But it could be something as simple. When you're doing those personas, they're basically a composite, sort of a composite picture of traits and needs and desires of a group of people. So they're never perfect, but they're better than thinking in terms of an amorphous general public. So I find it's helpful to start with, what you and your team members know about those audience, those visitors, and then see if someone can literally connect you with someone who fits the general description. This can get tricky in a lot of nonprofits. Sometimes program staff don't want marketing people talking to, say, a support group participant, or fund development may not necessarily want to connect you to one of their donors, but you could be surprised. So that is something worth asking, is to simply ask and say, do you know someone who's sort of like not vested, not a board member, not necessarily a volunteer, unless that's one of your audiences, but someone who seems to be engaged enough that we can ask them this favor. And it's really about asking a lot of the same questions, maybe not, asking them to tell you their age and their demographic information, but asking them, what do you need when you visit our site? Or what do you want to learn from our organization? And just ask.
That's a great answer. And I guess would this apply, one of the questions was, what if it's our first website and we've never had one before, and there isn't an ability to talk to the stakeholders and the visitors?
Well, they may not be.
Apply?
Yeah, they may not be visitors because there's no website yet, but you probably already have relationships with people, I hope, unless it's an absolutely brand new nonprofit. But even then, there are ways. If you're starting an absolutely brand new organization, I would assume that still comes from a connection to a community and trying to meet the needs of that community. So it's really about who do you have relationships with that could help you and give you some insights.
Yeah, for sure. Something that's really helpful is seeing what other maybe organizations doing the same work are doing, right? And seeing what potentially, who they are reaching out to.
Mm-hmm. If they're the same audiences as yours, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there's always an SEO question when it comes to websites that pops up with nonprofits. So how important is SEO and content strategy, building and creation for nonprofits?
Yeah, so this person maybe astutely saw how I sidestepped SEO and I didn't tackle it. I do know some basics about SEO, but I don't even though I work in this field and even though I help clients with website content strategy, I do not call myself an SEO copywriter, mm-hmm. and I don't normally get super involved in that side of it. That being said, I find it's often the organization's web developer who has a better understanding, and they can help you to do some keyword research to figure out what terms you do want to rank for, what terms it makes sense to go after that it won't be impossible to compete for. And if you have access to that intelligence and you're willing to take that on, then yes, you start to slot that into that content plan. You have a column for SEO and you list those words so that you can make sure to incorporate them into your content as you go. I do, somewhere on my site, have sort of like a very 101, I believe I do, and if not, Yesenia definitely does, Yesenia who I mentioned, about how you can just do some of the basic level optimizing your content for certain search terms. But I will also just quickly share an anecdote that the last client that I most recently this summer did a website content strategy for, their web developer said to me, just just make sure they're producing good content that serves people. I don't want to get lost in the SEO conversation, because what matters is that we have a good website. So that was an insight from a techie.
Yeah, and that's great to hear because I do think it is a lot. And definitely, I know people work in comms have been overwhelmed by that. So it's good to say just focus on the content and build from there.
Yeah, and you can go back and you can definitely go back and tidy up your content and optimize it after.
Yeah, and we'd be more than happy to, when we do upload the webinar, include that link as well in the summary so that people do get access to it.
Okay, great.
And I think that's it for today because that's all the time we have. But I did really want to thank you, Marlene, again for sharing your knowledge with us. Wonderful templates, everything made, perfect sense. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out to join us today. So just a reminder, we'll post the webinar recording and slides, as well as all the links to our website within a week. And please fill out the post brief webinar survey that will launch after the session if you have any additional questions, or if we weren't able to answer your questions today. Thank you and have a great rest of your day. And thanks so much, Marlene.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who spent your time with us for the last hour. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.